Thanks, Laura. Hello, everyone. Really lovely to see you, to meet you today. For those of you who don't know me, it looks like my camera is not working. We'll
We
keep
can see you,
going.
Paula.
You can
We
see
can
me.
see you.
That's
Yeah,
great.
we
That's
can.
great. Technology. I'm new. For those of you who don't know me, I am Carla Garn. I am a trustee and a fellow of the IIRSM, and I can't get the slides to move at the moment. There we go. Um, I've been a risk manager, crisis manager, business continuity manager, resilience person for a very long time now. And very excited to be talking to you all today. Wherever you are in the world, I'm sitting here in Australia. So welcome to all of the IIRSM members who are also sitting outside of the UK today. Third-party risk management is something that all organisations face, and in a world that's ever more interconnected, what affects one organisation has a ripple effect on every other organisation as well. Now, given our short time together, we're going to spend about 35 minutes talking and then time for questions and answers. I want to give you really practical suggestions on how you might want to start thinking about how you manage your third-party risks. Now, I want to stress that this is a sector agnostic session, so we're not going to look at specific industry requirements. You may have them, you may have regulatory requirements that you need to fulfill. We're not going to touch on those, but you just need to be aware that you might be subject to those. You might already have an embedded framework, and that's brilliant, but this session is really targeted at those who have very little or nothing in place already. None of the suggestions I'm going to make today are radical or new, but they are good practice, and it gives you a really good starting point for thinking about third-party risk management. So I've got an agenda and some key messages here for you. The agenda, we're going to walk through a high-level framework or checklist in detail. We're going to go through each section of that framework and give you some things to think about. And again, time for questions at the end. But I really want you to walk away with these three key messages. So I want you to think about the criticality of your third-party supplier relationships, how they impact your critical services. I want you to start thinking about how you can work with others in your organization collaboratively. You will hear me bang on a lot about this today. I think it's really important. And the third thing I want you to take away from the session today is how you might capture the great information that you're gathering about your supplier relationships into a central repository or register. And we'll talk about all of these things as we go along. By doing those three things, it's going to build greater resilience within your organization, and you'll have a far more coordinated approach to third-party risk management. Now, I also want to right up front qualify that I'm going to be looking at third-party risk management from a resilience, a continuity, a crisis management lens here today. These principles can be applied much more widely, but we're going to be focusing on your critical suppliers predominantly in the context of disruptions. And you'll understand more as we go through the session, but I wanted to put that right up front with you in case that's not what you were expecting to hear about today. So we've already said that this is a sector agnostic session where it's not specifically industry led. And the framework that we're talking about today is a very high level example of a framework you can use. As you become more mature, you can make it much more complex. But today we're just going to talk through the simple principles. Your starting points will all be very, very different. So you will all have different levels of criticality for your suppliers. You'll have different contract terms. You'll have different processes. You'll have different levels of mapping and assessment. But whatever your starting point, I really advocate for putting in place some simple strategies so that you can derive these benefits. So you want to be giving assurance to your senior executives or your board or your leaders, because anything that impacts your critical services, the responsibility of you delivering those services rests with you. And if you are relying on suppliers to help you provide those services, it doesn't matter if there's an incident at their end. Ultimately, the responsibility for any disruption sits with you. So you need to be getting this right. Another benefit is to have a much stronger business continuity framework or operational resilience framework, depending on your industry. And it will mean that you have better relationships and much better communication with your suppliers, and potentially understanding more about the entire length of the supply chain as well. And you'll save time, resources, and energy in collating the information that you gather here, by working closely with your colleagues. Now, I don't know which part of an organization you sit within at the moment, but you'll be wanting to work with your business continuity colleagues, your risk management colleagues, your health and safety colleagues, your IT colleagues, your DE&I and your ESG colleagues, your finance and procurement colleagues. Everybody has a part to play in this, and we'll uncover that as well. You'll also need to be managing those relationships with your third parties as well. So this is the framework. When preparing for this session, I ran it past some colleagues who said, don't you want to put some responsibilities next to each section of this framework? And my response to that was I wanted to really emphasize to you, the listeners, that you need to collaborate with the right people across your organization to make this framework work for you. None of you will have all of the skills or all of the answers when you are assessing and seeking assurances from suppliers. Everybody will bring their relevant skill set to this process. Now, when we do this in practice, there might be a sponsor or an overarching owner of the register or of the process, but everybody has a part to play in this process. And we need to make sure that we are inclusive. We bring the right people in at the right time with the right level of expertise. This isn't a hierarchical type of structure. Just quickly talking through the steps that you can see on your screen. So first of all, we're identifying our critical services. So this is step one. You may have already done this as part of your business continuity practices. If not, it's a great place to start. So during an incident, or a disruption, you can't protect everything. So you need to define what is most important to you as an organization and what you will focus your resources on as part of that response strategy. Once you've prioritized those critical functions, you can then look and see, are there any critical suppliers that help you deliver those services? So you've prioritized your services, activities, your goods, and then you need to determine which suppliers are critical to the delivery of those services. You don't necessarily need to do this for every supplier, as a note I've just made for myself. If there is third-party involvement in delivering those critical services, you need to define that involvement. Are there any time critical or other thresholds that you need to meet? Look at those service contracts. Look at service level agreements and communication channels. Is what is written in the contract aligned with your expectations? You'll need to risk assess the relationship and the dependencies, and you'll need to think about things like concentration risks. You'll need to consider business continuity plans. So are you on their plan or are they on your plan? And we'll talk more about that later. At a minimum, you need to be thinking about communication channels and how they'll communicate with you during an incident from either perspective. Then you'll need to look at your outsourcing policy or your third-party supplier policy. And I'm assuming you all have one. If you don't have one, it's a great place to start. And we'll talk about some information you might like to include as a guide as we go along. You'll also want to speak with those third-party suppliers and consider risk reviews or audits potentially. Following those conversations with all of the wonderful information you've been gathering, you will want to update your business continuity plans, and you'll also be wanting to look at your contracts and make sure that they're fit for purpose. You're going to want to document those relationship terms in your register. You're going to want to monitor, review, and update regularly. And for any new third-party relationships, you're going to want to be following these processes. So we'll talk about each of these in turn as we go along. But just before I start, looking at the practical aspects, I really want to stress the importance of collaboration. So the concepts we're discussing today all overlap, and you want to ensure that you've got a consistent approach. So here's a little bit of advice from me on areas I see go wrong and where I think it's critical to get things in place before you start this process. So as I said, I've worked with lots of organizations, and some organizations have very different approaches to risk management from department to department or business areas, whatever you call them. Some will have different risk appetites, some will have different ways of documenting their risks. Their risk registers all look different. The way they approach controls, the way they report on those risks is all different. If your organization is like that and you're thinking about doing something around third-party risks and putting together potentially a team of people to do this, this is a really great opportunity to try and harmonize your practices and processes, make them holistic, think about things in an enterprise risk management or an ERM way. And it might be a way to influence change across your organization, because you will need to approach this in a consistent manner. Everyone is going to need to use the same approach. You also might have what I like to call language challenges. So one team might use an industry or a regulatory term that another team or another part of the organization doesn't understand or uses differently. So for example, I often see the terms plans and policies used interchangeably. They are not the same thing. It doesn't matter what I think, but it matters what you and your colleagues think. You need to agree a common language within your organization. You might have a taxonomy that you use. Just make sure everybody within your working group or those you're collaborating with all understand the terms that you are using as part of this process, because it's those little tiny frictional things that can derail a project like this. It just helps for everyone to have a common understanding. And listening to one another is absolutely critical, and being really inclusive, because everybody is going to be bringing their skills and expertise from different areas, and you can learn a lot, but you will also make sure that the assurances you're seeking are fit for purpose. So let's talk about some practical considerations. So assuming you've mapped your critical processes from a business continuity perspective, and as part of that process, you have highlighted those third-party dependencies. You will be asking questions like, what service are they providing to us, and how does this fit in when we're delivering our services? What would the impact be if that service was unavailable? How long could we go without it? What are the consequences of not having that service? Now, these questions may have already been asked as part of your business impact analysis. So it's always good practice to go and check what information you already have to hand. So that's where you'll be collaborating with business continuity colleagues. And while the answer to those questions will form part of your assessment of that service, you'll need to think more widely. So what are the risks to the third party's service delivery, and how might you mitigate those if you need to? So where are they based? Could they be subject to something like a natural disaster? Now, I know of a large professional services firm who keeps their servers in the basement of their building. Now, there's nothing wrong with that in principle. However, they are based on the bank of a river that regularly floods. So if I am being supplied services by that firm, I would want to know that fact. Are they based in a geopolitical hotspot, or do they themselves have dependencies on somebody who is based in one of those hotspots? So, for example, lots of tech suppliers are based, or software suppliers are based out of Israel. It's technological hotspot. It's great. There's lots of innovative organizations there, but you might need to factor that in to your risk assessment. We talk about semiconductors a lot and production coming out of Taiwan. We need to think about the influence of China and the possibility of China invading Taiwan. What impact might that have on your organization? You might not think it will, but if you, for example, were considering updating all of your laptops for your entire organization or your PCs, that might have an impact, even if you don't work with or produce goods that have semiconductors in them, there still might be a knock-on implication for your organization. You need to be thinking about these things. What about their staff? Do they have enough people to continue their service to you if there's a disruption, and can they work from multiple locations? Are there any concentration risks? So do lots of people use the same supplier? And is there any alternative suppliers that you might be able to use? Do they subcontract or outsource any of the services that they provide to you? So these are just some of the questions you need to be thinking about. Then you're going to need to think about how you're going to satisfy yourself that the assurance that they're providing are sufficient to maintain the continuity of service to you, both in respect of their services as well as their third-party supply chain risks. How are they monitoring and managing their own third-party risk dependencies? So you're going to want to work with your business continuity and your IT colleagues to collate this information, document the assessment, as well as considering and talking through some high-level scenarios that might impact your service delivery. So let's think about a really high-level scenario that you could run internally and have a discussion about. So you rely on a particular supplier to deliver services that to deliver one of your most critical services. Now, unfortunately, the service they provide you is unavailable because their own critical supplier has suffered disruption and has now gone into administration. So even though this disruption has occurred at a distance, you are now in the position where your organization can no longer supply its critical service. How can you avoid this situation from happening? Is there anything you can mitigate those risks with to ensure that you can continue to operate and provide those critical goods or services? Next, you're going to think about looking at business continuity plans and service contracts. What are the service level agreements that you already have in place with your suppliers? Are they reflected in your business continuity plan and potentially their own business continuity plan? Now, while your third-party suppliers might be listed in your business continuity plan as someone to join your response team if an incident occurs, they might not be aware of that fact, or they may not be able to fulfill that responsibility. So this is a really common problem. We see this all the time, particularly at the moment. I'm seeing it a lot in insurers and pension scheme business continuity plans. And in particular, and of interest, and it might be relevant to you, lawyers, when we're surveying or talking to lawyers about their expectations of being called to join a business continuity team for a particular client, they're not aware of that responsibility, or if they are aware of that responsibility, they're not thinking more widely about it. And when you start probing them and saying, well, how many clients might you be called upon to join a response team? So imagine there is a massive disruption and it impacts a lot of a lawyer's, lots of the lawyer's clients. They cannot join the response team of 10, 20, 30 clients. There's only one of them. Do they have enough resource? Will they be stretched, or can they give you a decent service response? It's just something to think about. Just because, and this comes back to the point, just because you've written something on a business continuity plan doesn't mean it can or will happen. People need to know and understand their roles and responsibilities during an incident response. So think about what you want and need and expect from your third-party suppliers in terms of an incident response, whether something happens at their end or whether it happens from your end. Now, you might already have an outsourcing policy or a third-party supplier policy as part of your regulatory requirements. Or you might have it as part of your procurement processes. Even if you do, it makes sense to review it periodically. And here are some things that you might like to consider. So your due diligence process, what are you going to include as part of that process? So are you going to include financial information, any risks of insolvency, any history of mergers and acquisitions? Are they likely to be involved in those in the future? Are there any legal or regulatory risks that you can think of? Are there jurisdictional and geopolitical risks that we've talked about? Now, you might run a company report on them, but what is that really going to tell you about them? It's not going to tell you a lot. you need to think about how you're going to run that process and who is going to interpret the results of the searches that you're running for those assurances to make sense and to be suitable for your organization. You'll need to think about how you're going to manage the business continuity process. So is this going to be agreed ahead of signing any contracts with them? Who are the points of contact going to be in the event of a disruption? Or if you want to talk about things in between contracts, what are your agreed strategies? So, for example, your communication channels, what types of incidents will they notify you of if something happens at their end? How will they notify you? What is the time frame for those notifications? Um, think about all of those good things around their exercising. Will they include you in their exercises? Will they report on their exercises to you? These are all questions you might want to ask. Just think of a concrete example here. So imagine there's a power outage at your critical supplier, and you know that up to 4 hours isn't going to impact your services at all. You'll be fine if they're down for 4 hours. But if their power outage starts to bleed into 6, 8, 12 hours, you will want to know, because you will need to start implementing your own business continuity strategies. So how are they going to notify you, and when will you be notified? And can you have a conversation around thinking about any alternative solutions or any workarounds? You'll also want to think about how you measure their performance. So what would you do if their service was under par regularly, or they didn't pick up the phone when you called, or they didn't offer you a great deal of help? It's really important to be having these conversations. So you need to have those feedback mechanisms. You want to be talking to them before things become a really big issue. In some cases, you might be able to find another supplier, but if it's a really niche service, you might not have the luxury of finding somebody else to provide that service. Think about how they will notify you, or what your expectations are around notifying you around changes to their business. So what if their leadership team changes, or what if they're in financial distress? What are your expectations there? How could that impact your organization and the services you provide? Could you put in place perhaps some news monitoring, or are there other solutions that you could put in place to help keep track of those types of changes? Think about your approach to expectations on audits or site visits. So just because a supplier has said something on a survey or a questionnaire doesn't mean it is going to give you the assurances you need. Sometimes you might need to go on site and see for yourself, or potentially you might need to send in an expert to do that assessment for you. You're also going to want to think about your supplier's approach to subcontractors and their own supply chain due diligence. What level of assurance are you going to expect and require? So think about your own organization and the checks and balances you put in place. So, for example, if you are bringing an IT contractor on site to your organization, would you expect them to have undergone identity checks or some other kind of security check before you let them loose on your networks and systems? And in most cases, I expect that your organizations would say yes. So would you expect the same of your suppliers and their own subcontractors? Because it is entirely possible that going further down the supply chain, these people may have access to your networks and systems. And as we know, cyber criminals can come in all shapes and sizes and can come in all kinds of ways. This might be something you really want to consider a little bit more deeply. So this is not an exhaustive list. It's an illustrative example. But it helps give you some guardrails when you start thinking about reviewing your existing service contracts or those you may be entering into in the future. I hope you're all still with me. I'm conscious that these are a lot of concepts and a lot of words coming at you, so I hope you're all still okay. If you need to wriggle, get up and wriggle. I can't see you, but stay with me. We're getting there. It's time to take the data you've been collecting. You've collected a whole heap of really interesting and useful information, and you want to go and talk to your suppliers. You don't need to talk to all of them, but you need to start building relationships with them, because if your service, if they are critical to delivering your service, this is going to be a really advantageous relationship. So you'll go in and you'll be armed with a couple of things. So you'll be armed with your expectations from your critical service mapping and your policy requirements, but you'll also have a list of questions as well. So for example, you might want to talk to them about things like their resourcing capabilities. What is their view on what their biggest risks might be? How do they expect to provide continuity of service to you during a disruption? And what are their own subcontracting or outsourcing arrangements? And what you want to leave with is a level of assurance or a plan to take action to seek such assurances so that you can feed this back into your own response strategies and your own business continuity plans. So this is something that is becoming more and more commonplace, although many industries, I have to say, are still fairly immature around this. And while people quite often do it from a high level IT stance, or they might try and use standardized supplier surveys, it's less common for more detailed open conversations to take place. Now, the quality of information that I see, and perhaps you see as well from standardized surveys, is often poor because of a number of reasons. So the questions are standard and they don't fit the types of responses that you need, or they don't understand the criticality of the supplier. They're poorly drafted. They don't ask for the types of information that you actually need, or the service providers just don't answer the questions, or they misunderstand the questions. So that's why having a conversation can really help, although your supplier might not be used to that approach. Now, it's generally not because the suppliers are unwilling to help or they want to be obstructive. They might be fearful because they don't have the answers, or they think if they do it for one client, they'll need to do it for everybody else. And just put yourself in their shoes for a moment. If one of your clients, or further up the supply chain, asked you to do this, how might you feel if you were asked to do this? So always remember the other person's perspective here. So here's some advice that I have found really useful when I'm doing this. So clearly define what you want and what you need from that conversation. This is going to be the start of a long-term ongoing relationship. You will not get all of the information you need in that first conversation. You need to be willing to collaborate, that word again, and work with them to build that relationship. You need to frame that conversation in a really positive light rather than imposing demands. So, for example, one of your agenda items might be around business continuity. So you might walk in and say, we know you've got lots of clients and we're really curious how you'll communicate with each of us in an incident. What types of incidents will you notify us of? Now, that way, you're opening the door to have a conversation or a dialogue around what's important to you. You might have a particular incident that is really important to you that you need to be notified of. And you can start, that's a starting point for your negotiations as well. If possible, set an agenda for the conversation and provide them with a list of questions you're seeking answers to up front. Now, that gives them an opportunity to make sure all the right people are in the room when you're having that conversation so that they can give you the right assurances, the assurances you need to be hearing. And similarly, you need to be doing the same thing. You need to have the right people around the table to be listening to those assurances and to be able to tell you, yeah, that's actually what we need to hear, or it's not good enough. If you don't have the right people with the right skills, you might want some independent assurance, then consider risk assurance reviews or risk audits, because they are becoming more commonplace. But remember that there are also other accreditations or certifications that you might be able to accept without going into a really, really deep dive. So based on your conversations, you want to update all of the relevant documentation, including business continuity plans, and as needed and if appropriate and if possible, your contract terms. This is the time to make sure all of that information is captured in some kind of centralized register or document so that it can be regularly reviewed and updated by anyone in your organization who needs it. Now, it doesn't need to be a massive undertaking, but it will help with things like contract renewals, withdrawals from supplier relationships, the ability to amend service level agreements or other contractual requirements. So think about capturing the types of things you can see on your screen at the moment. And it goes without saying that it will need to be monitored and regularly updated. It needs to be a living, breathing document. It cannot remain static. Who owns the register? Well, that's going to depend on your organization. In some organizations, it's a finance or a procurement department. And remember that people enter into supplier contracts all the time. So think about whether a new supplier might be relevant to a critical service. So you need to be mindful of that as well. The key here is to assess the criticality of that supplier relationship and also understand how their relationship with you might impact your critical services. You need to remember, though, that whoever owns the register needs to seek feedback and information from the wider community in your organization. As we've already said, everybody will bring their specific skills to the table when you're seeking those assurances. New suppliers, it goes without saying that you need to run through this process and use those subject matter experts. I am often asked to look at business continuity plans for third-party suppliers and provide assurances based on just looking at a business continuity plan. I can offer a view of what I would expect to see in a business continuity plan, but that does not mean that an organization is resilient. So I need to understand their resilience posture. I need to look at a lot of things. So, for example, how often do they exercise? How do they train their team? How do they feed back the recommendations from that exercise into their business continuity plan or their wider strategy? Do they do horizon scanning for emerging risks? And do they take those into consideration in their planning? Do they include their own suppliers in their exercises, for example? Now, that's a really crude example, but it's just, it illustrates that just by looking at somebody's business continuity plan or knowing that they've got one does not mean they are resilient and does not mean that they will be responsive to you during an incident that might impact them. And that will have a knock-on effect to your own delivery of your critical services. So you need somebody with the right skills to assess the assurance, but you also need that person to have potentially to have conversations with the supplier to make sure that those assurances come to life. Now, this has been a really quick and high level tour through basic third-party risk management. Here are some questions that you might want to start thinking about when you are implementing this for your organization. So how are you seeking those assurances and what assurances are you actually seeking? So think about your own risk appetite. Think about the impact of disruption on your activities, and remember that the responsibility rests with your organization. Just because a disruption happens with a third-party supplier doesn't mean you're off the hook. You will still be responsible. You still need to be providing the best services or the best goods or the best activities for your clients or customers. How far down the supply chain do you want to go when you're seeking those assurances? Now, if you're just starting out, everybody's got to start somewhere. So you might not go second or third tier or further than, having those initial conversations. You can develop and mature. But think about things like, what is your approach or your appetite towards subcontractors or their own outsourced suppliers or any associated risks around that? Are there any regulatory drivers that you need to be alive to? And think about that cybersecurity point, because I think it's a really interesting angle. And how do you capture all of this information around these third parties? There will be lots and lots of information available within your organization. Bring it all together and consolidate it so that you can have a holistic view of how you might manage these relationships. Now, if you're not folding third-party risk management into your current processes, now's a great time to start. It doesn't need to be complicated, but by understanding how they fit into your critical services and activities and how you'll work together during a disruption or how you can pivot to another supplier during a disruption means that you can start building a much more resilient organization, and your processes will be better. You'll save time and energy and resources. So thank you for being attentive and listening today. We've got a series of blogs that we've created that goes alongside this talk today and goes into greater depth around a lot of the things that I've talked about. You can access them on the BW Risk portal for free. Details are on the screen at the moment, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Carla. That was really, really interesting. Thank you so much. So yeah, just a reminder, if anybody's got any questions, pop them into that Q&A box along the bottom bar of your screen. Just to kick off with the questions, so I guess the first one would be, how do you ensure collaboration between departments, internally in managing third-party risk?
So if this is something that's new to you and it's something that you're energized by or you're recognizing as a risk, we're all risk managers. Everybody in an organization is a risk manager. So you might need to go out and be proactive. It might be your responsibility to go out and find the right people or start having conversations with people and highlight some of the things we've talked about today, because until you know about those risks, you're not going to start managing them. So good risk managers in all of our guises, whatever our title is, we go out and we have conversations with people, and we kick the tires and we make sure that we're starting to spread that message. So as part of your role, start bringing people together.
Thank you. And then the next one is, how would you handle third parties that are maybe a bit more unwilling to comply with your requirements?
This is the perennial question, and I think it comes back to the point I made around framing the conversations positively and trying to give them as much information as you can up front. Put yourself in their shoes and understand why they might be feeling a little bit defensive around asking your questions, and having some responses ready around why you need to have that information. So, we want to make you are really important to us. We really rely on you. We really want to have this conversation with you because if something happens with you or if something happens with us, we need to make sure that we can manage that disruption together. And as I said, you're not going to have all of the answers up front. And many organizations don't have uh, the continuity strategies in place. And in some cases, you might be able to help them or point them in the right direction so that they can get their own house in order. Some people don't know where to start. So it might be up to you as a risk professional to be able to say, well, have you thought about, getting a continuity strategy in place, or have you thought about your risks? And that's part of building that relationship, but without being patronizing in any way. You need to be collaborative, really, really collaborative with them.
That's all the questions we've got at the moment. So just a big thank you to yourself, Carla. Thank you to everyone for joining us. A couple of you are asking if you can watch it back. So it's going to be available on the RSM member resource hub, as well as, I believe, the BW Risk portal as well. Carla, that's correct?
Absolutely. Yep. Absolutely.
Great. So if anybody does want to watch it back, you're welcome to. I think we might have another question. Another one pop in.
Sure.
So, okay, so how are you finding engagement with the process? Would small or medium-sized contractors be more engaged?
I tend to find small to medium sized contractors are more engaged, even if their level of maturity is less. They are more engaged, and they are more willing to have those open conversations. And it's interesting because you'd think bigger organizations have got more resource. It's actually smaller and medium-sized organizations that are tending to be much friendlier in these processes. So yeah, that's a really interesting observation as well. I don't know if other people have found that as well.